Good evening. Thank you so much for joining us for tonight's book launch event with Shruti Swamy and Rajiv Mohabir, celebrating the launch of Shruti's spectacular debut novel, The Archer. My name is Lily Philpott. I am the programs manager at the Asian American Writers Workshop, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to our virtual event space. A quick visual description of me. I have short black hair. I'm wearing glasses and a blue and red printed dress. And there are a number of photos and a mirror on the wall behind me. Please do say hi. Let us know in the chat where you're watching from. I am speaking to you all from Brooklyn, New York, which is on ancestral and unceded Canarsie and Munsee Lenape land. For all those of you who are new to the AAWW, we are a national nonprofit organization dedicated to uplifting Asian diasporic literature and storytelling. We hold frequent readings and conversations like this one. We actually just announced our full fall event season, which you can check out on our website. We organize community arts programming in New York City high schools and senior centers. We run fellowship programs for emerging writers of color, and we publish an award-winning online literary magazine called The Margins. You can visit us on aaww.org. You can follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube, where the recording of this event will be posted. I want to thank our friends at Books Are Magic, who are our virtual booksellers for this event. You can find a link to purchase Shruti and Rajiv's books in the chat, and we hope you'll do so and support a local independent bookstore as you do. During the event, we ask that all audience members practice nonviolence in the chat. Comments that are racist, transphobic, homophobic, ableist, and/or misogynist will be flagged, and the person will be removed from this event. We will have time for audience Q&A at the end of the hour. You can ask your questions via the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. I am going to briefly introduce Shruti and Rajiv, and then I hope you will join me in welcoming them both. Shruti Swamy is the author of the story collection, A House is a Body, which was a finalist for the PEN Robert Bingham Prize, the LA Times Book Prize for First Fiction, and longlisted for the Story Prize. Her work has been published by the Paris Review, McSweeney's, and anthologized in the O. Henry Prize Stories. Her debut novel, The Archer, was published by Algonquin Books yesterday. Rajiv Mohabir is the author of 3 collections of poetry: Cutlish, The Cowherd's Son, which was the winner of the Kundiman Prize, and The Taxidermist's Cut, which was winner of the 4-Way Books Intro Prize. He also translated I Even Regret Night, Holy Songs of Demerara, and received the 2020 Harold Morton Landon Translation Award from the American Academy of Poets. His memoir, Anti-Man, received the Restless Books New Immigrant Writing Prize, and currently he is an assistant professor of poetry in the MFA program at Emerson College and translations editor at Waxwing Journal. We are so thrilled to have both Shruti and Rajiv with us this evening. Please join me in welcoming Shruti on screen to read.
Thank you so much, Lily, and thank you so much, everyone, for being here with me tonight. It was so beautiful listening to that music as you guys are all coming in, and hopefully that brings you a little bit into the world of the book, which is set in 60s and 70s era Bombay, and it's a lot about the art form of Kathak dance, and I will be reading a section tonight. From kind of halfway through the book, my protagonist is participating in a play where she is performing a composition that she created based on Tennyson's The Lotus Eater, the poem. And I think that's all you need to know. Though the days were brutally hot, the evenings were violet and gentle. The clouds gathered and swollen with light, diffusing it without bursting with rain. It was the last of the weeks before the heat of exams would start. Already the most serious, like Radha, had buckled themselves to their studies. But lovers became more romantic and friends more social, like farmers working hard to pull in the abundance of wheat to the last bitter months of dust. I practiced my stage makeup in the mirror. I had gotten good at drawing on new eyes around the eyes I already possessed. Such broad strokes did not require a skilled hand. Eyes that were meant to be seen from far away, and from far away, they could strike you dead. I did not own lipstick and had to borrow some from Fernaz to give myself carmine mouth. I did not have foundation, so I didn't bother with it. I asked Anand to get me flowers to braid into my hair. He showed up at my hostel with a useless bouquet of red roses, long-stemmed, heavy, and expensive, tied with a long, silly ribbon printed with teddy bears. Anand, what am I supposed to do with these? Girls love roses, Anand said. But I told you, Anand, it's for my hair. He shrugged. What do I know about hair? No man had ever given me flowers before, let alone such velvet roses. I snapped the heads off the flowers and pinned them down my braid, wet ink black punctuated by drops of blood. They were too heavy for the turns I would make on stage. They would weigh me down and throw me off balance when I made my quick and final turns, no matter. My mirror showed me the mask of my face, and I was pleased. I walked across the soft grass to the auditorium, already dressed in my white costume, a cotton salwar kameez, and my alarming face visible to all who passed me. And backstage, I sat down to tie my ghungroos. The boys, my boys, for they were mine suddenly. I felt for them the affection a mother might feel watching her children from a distance. They gave off the pleasant stink of nervous energy, ribbing one another until it was time to be quiet and take their places. I stood half watching from the velvet wing, the boys on stage, the ripple of the audience, illuminated only by reflected light, light vaguely outlining noses and lips and the gleam of glasses in the dark. But I wasn't watching anything. I was listening to the poem, which was read first by Anand very seriously in English, slowly and a little too theatrically, if you asked me, for the poem by itself was enough. Still, the poem, which I hadn't truly listened to in months, had an odd effect on me. It dampened the light, it softened my breath, it lifted me out of myself. The texture and the tone of the words, the rise and fall of them, felt as familiar at that moment as my own breath, like something sprung out of my own mind or from my own dream, long ago dreamt and only half forgotten, existing like a ghost at the periphery of my consciousness, not a terrible ghost, but a sweet one. For many minutes after Anand had finished reading, the actors were on stage, speaking their Hindi lines. I was not conscious of the play at all, even from where I was standing. I felt like I was on the edge of something and I wanted to reach it. Before an idea becomes an articulation, it hangs before you like a cloud. You cannot grasp it. It was Anand who shook me out of this reverie and pushed me on stage, for I had nearly missed my cue. The actors were slumped on stage, dreaming. They had chewed their lotus and made a dream. I was that dream in white. The light changed, but the music didn't start. Between the time I lifted my foot and set it down, I realized I needed no music. The first blow of my foot against the stage drove me hard into my dance. It nearly crushed me into it. I was a dream, beautiful at first, but of my own accord, I grew angry. I was not a good dream. I was not a good wife, content forever to wait. I was not a good woman, but a rageful one, and my rage was terrible. I gathered it and thrust it up between my eyes. I was crossing the stage to look and look against the sea for my lost husband. I was nursing my son into a man, feeding and dressing him. I was growing him into a warrior. Again and again, my hands shaped a lotus at my breast, but each time they did so, the lotus became sharper, like a star-pointed blade. So much time was passing. I grew older, but the intensity of my dancing increased with my age instead of lessening. It was against everything I had been taught to dance like this, so wildly, not building the column of energy up from the cool center, not filling the limbs with remote movement, practiced to the point of sleepwalk perfection, and then infused with the subtle emotions of the eyes and brows and mouth. My dance teacher was right to be shocked. The movements my body made were almost out of my control. My body wanted to vibrate out of its shell. Since there was no one there to speak the bulls, I spoke them. It was a shock to hear my voice so rough out of my mouth. At another time, I might have felt embarrassed. For this rough, anger-filled voice was my true voice. I knew as soon as I had heard it, the one that I had strove to disguise from everyone and from myself. My legs hurt with the force of their exertion, and I felt it even as I pressed onward. I turned, the huge heavy braid wrapped around my neck like a rope. I turned, I grew older. The beat of my heart was quick, subdivided into fifths and eighths by my feet. From the rafters, a soft snow fell, white petals that stuck to my skin where they touched me, glued by sweat. I had not known it would happen, and for a moment I was startled, as though I myself had conjured it from the force of my dancing. The white petals looked blue in the light, as I did. Again, I felt myself close to something, very close, but not enough to grasp. I could not push myself over the brink. Then it was over. I stood posed on the stage, panting. I had not been on a stage with the eyes of an audience on me in several years, and when I returned to myself in the room that held me, I could make out individual faces in the crowd. I saw the black muzzle of a camera, and when it was lowered, I saw the face I had half looked for since I had seen it so many months ago from my window, the pale face of the man who walked with Anand. One row behind him, and slightly to the right, was another face I had looked for, the dark face whose familiar contours I had long gazed at these weeks in the privacy of my memory. When I lifted my eyes to her, her eyes looked back. Was it my eyes, the cold light, or were her cheeks wet with tears? And I'll end there.
Thank you, Shruti, so much for such a wonderful reading. First of all, I'd like to say congratulations on the birth of your second born book, The Archer. You know, I so loved your prose, the quality, the beautiful imagery, you know, of A House is a Body. And then when I read The Archer, I was just completely floored that you've like taken the energy of one like story that you've really expanded into, you know, this full length novel. And I have to say, first of all, I'm astonished and I'm glad, and thank you for letting me read this book and talk with you tonight. And I guess I want to start our conversation thinking about, you know, working in these two very different forms. You know, what is the difference for you between writing something like a short story and then a novel? Is it something about the story that requires more space to come out?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question, Rajiv. It's been so long. Me and Rajiv met in Kundiman in 2015 and have not seen each other since. So I felt like when you appeared on the screen, I was like, it's been a very tender and overwhelming days. I almost just feel like it's like my long lost friend. I'm so happy to see you, and it's like such a joy to see you here today. Thank you so much for being with me to celebrate this book. And that's such a wonderful question. Yeah, I have written, I thought of myself primarily as a short story writer. I spent much more of my life as a writer writing short stories. And with this book, I felt immediately like I knew it was going to be a novel. I had written the first chapter just immediately, like one day I wrote this chapter. I was working on a completely different project, and this chapter sort of sprang from my fingertips unbidden, and it just flowed out completely effortlessly, like a gift or like a challenge, like it's a complicated gift, because I felt that there was so much story packed in that first chapter, and I didn't know how to unravel it. The tools that you use to make a story are just completely different than the tools you use to make a novel. At least I found that. And I wonder if it's similar. You're a poet, and maybe you primarily still think of yourself as a poet, but then you wrote this beautiful work of nonfiction hybrid work. And I'd be curious, you don't have to say right now if you want to, but I wonder if it's the same thing. I often wonder if going from poetry to prose is just as hard a leap as going from short stories to long fiction, because just the musculature is really different. Like you have to have, I think novels are much more technical and have to have a lot more structure in them. But the chapter could not have stood alone as a story, and it had a whole life in there, and it also had the beginnings of a world in there that is a world that I wanted to spend more time in. So for many years, actually, I just sat I had that was a Word document, that chapter. And then after that, for years, I just was writing in my notebook, trying to find the contours of this world and find the edges of it and find my characters. And then very slowly, I started to piece together something that was more of a story.
Thank you for that. That's a very thoughtful answer. And thank you actually for putting it into a situation that I would understand a little bit more, going from poetry to nonfiction, and how the musculature that you speak about is so important. You say, and I kind of want to push back against this. You say that you created a world. Shruti, you created a universe.
Thank you.
I'm so astonished by so many aspects of this book, like I said, and you know, one of the journeys in this book that's kind of central to it, in my understanding, are the kinds of mythologies that are bumping up next to each other. You read a little bit about the Lotus Eaters, but in that scene, there are layers here. You know, and you do this definitely in your novel. You also do it in your short story collection. You know, for example, you write, you know, the story from the perspective of one of Ravan's queens as the city of Lanka is being sacked, and then also the blue-skinned god Krishna, who appears in the story collection as well. And then here also there's a very intimate connection and relationship with Hindu mythology. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about your relationship with myth and story making, like in general, how they're connected to you. And I'm going to talk more. My next question is going to be about, you know, Ekalavya. So maybe don't talk about Ekalavya.
Okay, I won't yet. Yeah, that is a wonderful question. I think when I think about that question, the first thing that comes to my mind is that my dad, who is here tonight, shout out to my dad. My dad told me stories every single night when I was growing up. When I was a kid, he told me a bedtime story like almost every single night. And often they were original. Sometimes I somehow also just ingested all of these myths. I don't remember I feel like my dad mostly made up stories, but I think I was also getting stories from his childhood. I got stories from my mom's childhood from her, and I got, I think there was a kind of mythic quality to the way that I understood my parents' histories. The myths in Hindu mythology are set in India, are set in a mystical, like a mythical place, but also on like Mount Kailash or Lanka, you know, places that are real historical geographical places that you can actually theoretically visit. And in the same way, when my parents talked about Bombay and I got the sense of the world that they grew up in, it was that same blend of like the mythical of this time and place that has vanished. You know, the Bombay that exists now, and even when I was a child, was vastly different than the Bombay that I was writing about and that they grew up in. So I got that mythic sense from them. And also it was a real place, almost in the same way that these characters were both imaginary and real. So I think that was sort of where the world started brewing in me. And I always had the sense, I just feel like there's just so many stories in my family that I got used to very early thinking about myself through narrative and sometimes like through mythic narrative. Like there's the story that my dad always tells of how, I don't know, maybe I'm getting too off topic. There's a story about how my dad always tells a story about how there was the night I was born, my grandmother's cook in India had a dream about a grand lady in a sari sitting on the wall that separated their two houses. And the cook saying, "When she come on in?" And the grand lady saying, I've been waiting to come in here for a long time. And now today I can finally at last come in. So, you know, when you hear stories like that as a child, it gives you a really mythic, in a beautiful way, a kind of a sense of continuity and a sense of, you know, like mythic connection with these things, and also an idea of narrative.
Yeah, thank you for that. And thank you for like actually articulating, you know, the framework of mythology as being kind of like a template for how we understand reality, and how mythology doesn't actually stop with, you know, stories of Krishna or stories of whatever, but also extends to like, you know, the parents' generations of like, you know, what their homes were like when they were children. You know, my parents were also teenagers in the 60s and 70s. And so reading this, I had, you know, we lived in a very different part of the world, but having that kind of familiar connection to me was something that was, part of my own kind of obsession with mythology, and seeing it in action was quite wonderful. And then I also think about, the title of this novel and how that plays into kind of what I'm calling one of the central myths or stories that is of Ekalavya and also Krishna, and the way that you nuance the conjunctions of these myths as they come together. Whether it's through character names such as Vidya, which means knowledge, and Radha, who is Krishna's consort, etc. And there's like the various incarnations of Guru, right? Whether it is of clay in the story of Ekalavya, or if it's the first Guru of the dancer and then the second. And I was wondering if you could talk about this particular story, if you could tell us a little bit about the Ekalavya story, and then also what does it mean for you to work closely or not closely with this myth and the limitations for you. And the freedoms, I'm sorry, not just limitations.
No. Yeah, great. So the myth of Ekalavya is what gives this book its title, which it's about, I won't tell the whole story, but I'll just summarize by saying that it's about an archer who is born to be an archer and is an incredibly gifted archer. And through following the dictums of his time, seeks to, tries to pursue his art of archery and is very brutally prevented from doing so because of his station in society. And this was a really brutal story to me. It was something that I really tried to understand. I really grappled with when I heard it as a child and even now. And I think, as you pointed out in my story collection too, there's a lot of Hindu mythology as well. And that was something like, I just realized that these stories are so rich and were so part of the fabric of my narrative self when I was a child, that I realized how much I have been pulling from Hindu mythology was something that I didn't actually notice until somebody pointed that out to me in the story collection. And again, in The Archer, that it's something that I reach for because there's so much nuance in these stories and they're so ancient and have so many layers. And with this story, it actually comes sort of late, and it came sort of late to be so central in the book. It was something that was sort of kind of kicking around in the back of my head, but actually the way it revealed itself to me is kind of, it obviously became central, but was something that I was truly trying to grapple with. A lot of this book is actually things I'm trying to grapple with. I actually realized that maybe I haven't even really given a quick summary what happens in this book or what it's about. So this book, it takes place in 60s and 70s Bombay, and it follows Vidya, who it's a coming of age story. And part of it is about her family life as a child and the trauma of her family life. And part of it is coming of age and coming of artistry story. So she's pursuing Kathak dance, which is a North Indian classical dance form. And she's really trying to make a place for herself in the world and find herself as an artist. And so I do realize that many of the things that I've been thinking through in this book are things that I have been grappling with in my own life. Like the story of Ekalavya was so brutal to me. I wanted to understand a different way to read. I wanted to find another piece of wisdom in it that I hadn't gotten yet. So it was spending a lot of time with that and looking at it through a new angle, which forms kind of the narrative or like the emotional core of the book. And other things that I was grappling with were just, coming of age, trying to be a woman artist in the world, to find your voice, to find your path and find your place, to try and make a kind of art that you haven't actually seen yet, and to make a place in the world that you don't really have a model for. These were also things I was really grappling with, that Vidya grapples with in a really specific time and place that's different than mine. But those questions really were urgent to me when I was writing them.
Yeah, and like any kind of mythic story, as this becomes like a template for understanding, you as like Shruti as human being artist in the world, it's another kind of layer here. And then, the mythology is just one of those layers. I would be remiss if I don't talk about Kathak as a dance. Even Kathak, the word comes from the word katha, which means story, I guess, in Sanskrit, or so the internet tells me. But it combines so many Hindustani, North Indian classical traditions, but one of which is the storytelling of the dance and the way that you write the dance, the feelings that that inhabit the characters and that transgress your characters. It just, to me, it thrums with life. And I wonder for you, what is it about Kathak that you were drawn to specifically? Like, do you dance, or how did this idea, how did this, come to you?
Yeah, I've never, I've never danced, or even actually, I think, attempted to dance Kathak before in my life. I do sort of dance, but only in a fun way, not in the way that Vidya dances in this book, which is very intense. Why Kathak? Kathak is, in particular, of all the dance forms that I don't have I don't have like a vast and detailed knowledge of all the Indian classical dance forms, or even Kathak. I am still a novice in my understanding of Kathak in many ways. I did the research I could do to try and render it faithfully, but I'm by no means a Kathak expert, is maybe what I'm trying to say. But to me, Kathak, it does have that storytelling element, and that becomes really important to some parts of the book. And it also has a really strong non-narrative element, and that felt really singular to this art form, or at least the way that it is practiced in this art form, or it is expressed in this art form. Kathak is characterized by really swift movements of the feet, like swift, rapid, mathematical, rhythmic movements of the feet, as well as these really sharp and precise turns. And this section of the dance that it highlights these elements was something I was really drawn to. Because as a writer and as somebody who's always working with language, it almost seemed like a way to sidestep the limitations of language. There's something so transcendent about watching a body move like that your body immediately understands. It's outside of language. It's outside of cultural context. It's just it resonates in your body. So seeing that those movements lending themselves kind of perfectly or intuitively, it felt right to be exploring this dance form. And as I got deeper, I was thinking about this, where I just understood that it's a centuries old tradition, and it's just got centuries of meaning and symbolism in these movements. So actually, some of the ways that it became very easy to write about, because without having to do much in a heavy-handed way, I could say a lot about it could do a lot of narrative work. I think it could have a lot of significance without me needing to do very much to interpret it, because it's layered with it's had centuries to grow and develop into these incredibly complex and beautiful forms. And why those are the like more esoteric reasons I was drawn to Kathak. But I was introduced to Kathak by my mom. My mom is a Kathak dancer, and I don't think I ever really saw her perform, but I definitely had a lot of conversations with her actually when I was writing this book, or when I was thinking about this book, and the way she talked about Kathak was really compelling to me. So that was one of the reasons that I was drawn to writing about it.
Oh wow, that's so it sounds so intensely ingrained in, again, that mythic web of story that you were kind of like born into, right? Or I really like the idea of Kathak also having a very strong non-story element. And one of the things that I was reading this book, and this can be a quick yes or no if you don't want to talk about it or anything, but like it reminded me of Umrao Jan, just because that's like my point of reference, which was this film from the 80s about a Kathak dancer, and thinking about the kind of dedication that these dancers have to their art. And you say that you've never danced, but the prose in this book reads as like a dancer is actually writing the story. So I wanted to kind of make space for that research that you've done, that it's just so well fleshed out. I mean, what do I know? I'm not a Kathak dancer either. Where I'm sitting as I'm reading it, I was so bewitched by that. And so, we've talked a little bit about these kinds of aspects of mythology and dance that have illuminated the story, this novel. And I'd like to think about another craft move that you do here, that I've been thinking about a lot, is that, like, I've heard people say this, and and I'm not sure, but writing in the third person is passé. and that is something that I've been like battling with. And when I get to you know, the second portion of the book, the second section of the book, I see that you do some very interesting things to implicate me as a reader, not me, but the reader, in the transition into first person. And I had to put the book down because I was so arrested by the mood. Because I was like expecting this one thing, and then I was like, oh, okay, I get the pattern. And then all of a sudden, it was like life came into me, as though I was Vidya experiencing that rapture. And I was shocked into my body after experiencing the story, and like wham, I was hit, I was there. And you know, I'm gonna, if it's okay, I'll read the first couple sentences of part 2. It says, you write, "Were you always I? For there was a day I arrived to myself, when I became I." And as I got here, I was dying to ask you about your relationship with writing in the first person.
Thank you so much, Rajiv. My relationship to writing in the first person, well, I felt like, I mean, this was sort of I understood later one of the things that had happened when I was writing this book, which is that I do feel like my diction, my sentences, like how lyrical my sentences are, everything, there's a distinction between my first person and my third person stories. Like so much so that I actually at one point had considered making A House Is a Body only first person stories, because I felt like, do these third person stories really fit in? Like these voices feel really distinct, and I can tell that I wrote them. Like I can tell I wrote them, and they have like a shared like perspective, but they are really distinct. So I think that there was a way that I think the first person, it's a little bit more cerebral. I was going to say that the sentences are longer, but I was last night reading from a section from the first section, which is in third person. And I was like, oh, wow, that really was all one sentence. So my sentences, unfortunately, for people who don't like long sentences, my sentences are long throughout. You cannot escape from a long Swamy sentence in this book. There are also short sentences for people who like short sentences, but there's also long sentences. I felt like with the third person sections, those are in the past, more of the past, the deeper past of the book, and of Vidya's childhood. And I kind of like wanted a sense of distance, that I felt like I wanted a sensory experience of the world and of childhood, like the way we experience childhood. But it's like when you think about yourself as a child, I almost feel like I see a photograph of myself, like I'm outside my body, and I look at this child, a picture of a child, and I think, how could that have ever been me? There's like an objectification, like you're so far removed from that phase of your life that it just is so distant and abstract. And you have it's the strange thing where you have these really sensory memories, but when you think about being in a body that small, or when I do, I feel a real sense of distance, like I can't climb back in. So that also just tracked very well with Vidya actually really genuinely coming into herself and forming a sense of self very suddenly, very startling. And that's more immediate for me to write in the first person. I really feel like I'm much closer to her lived experience in that I section. And both of those were important to me. There's a lot of trauma in her early life. And I think trauma also gives you that distance, where some sensory experiences are very immediate and some narrative things are confusing, but both childhood and trauma can do that. They can blur the narrative, blur your sense of self in your own body while still you're experiencing some of that stuff. So that's what I was trying to do. And it took me a really, really long time to figure out how to do it, because I wrote that section, that When I Became I section, very early on, and then just stared at it, understanding that it belonged in the book. I was writing a lot of sections in third person and a lot of sections in first person, and not understanding how they fit together. And I wrote a bridge. I wrote that as a bridge, unknowingly. I wrote that as a bridge, and then started to understand how those sections came together.
Wow, it's definitely a bridge into interiority. because that's when, when the kind of like waking up of the self happens through dance and in the dancing movements, do we get this kind of embodied perspective onto who Vidya is? Like, for example, the part that you read earlier tonight about the flowers in her hair as a dancer, and then instead of bringing like flowers for her hair, the guy brings roses, and she's like, "What the hell am I going to do?" Which I think is just kind of it's funny because she's having that moment as well, like, "Oh, it's nice flowers, but what the hell, man." And so that brings me to like this question that is, for me, it's personal, in that I felt particularly seen in the way that this part was written. And I don't want to give away too much of the story, but I'm going to talk a little bit about aspects of queerness that as I encountered, I was grateful for not having having it be this is a queer moment, and that to me felt very generous, and it felt open, and I felt receptive to this. And so, it shows you show an actual bodily orientation of Vidya to one of the other characters. I guess I can I say the name of the character?
Yeah, totally.
Okay.
Yeah, it's fine. Yeah, we should talk about it.
So yeah, because there's this intimate connection, that Vidya has with the woman Radha, who is also studying at the same school that she is. And the way that it was rendered was so incredible in terms of awareness of one's body in proximity to another person's body, and even when it comes to like clothes and the sensuality that was written. And I was wondering about if you can talk about like the different queernesses that you've woven into this book, and the decisions that you've had to make about it. I mean, because this is, definitely an orientation that I would say that somebody who belongs on the periphery, much like your protagonist, absolutely is this. She doesn't seem to fit if it's with her birth family, her guru, her first guru, her second guru, the students she has, college classmates, and in her intimate relationships with Radha and others. Yeah, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, definitely. And thank you so much for this question. What I really appreciate about it is that, right, it's not a queer, like there is a queer, like an explicitly queer, like narrative element or like narrative moment that happens. But what I feel like you're doing is naming this as a queer book. And I love that, because it's true that I was thinking about how there's some ways in which Vidya is like pushing against these roles. It's pushing against these roles that feel really restrictive to her, and it feels really uncomfortable in them. It feels like she's performing aspects of womanhood, etc. But there's also like, she dances Krishna, right? And Kathak is traditionally a soloist's art form. And in more recent years, people have done incredibly innovative things, including like dance dramas and things where they bring in lots of dancers. But I think as it was developed, this was a soloist art form, right? So it was totally normal for such a narrative form, with the elements that are narrative, be very normal for a dancer of any gender to inhabit many different bodies during the course of a single story, right? If they're the only one on there, it's just, of course, very normal. It makes me think of many of the like ways that gender is so fluid and tricky in Hindu mythology, and some of the stories I've read, and how there's a queerness. So there's a queerness sort of inherent in these stories or these ways of being that might not read like that because we have like maybe a Western understanding of them. But there are these concepts that exist, like centuries old concepts of fluidity and sensuality, that felt organic to the culture I was writing about also. So yeah, I was definitely, I wasn't really necessarily, it wasn't something that I necessarily injected into it. Was something that I felt was arising pretty organically from the text.
I want to pick up on something you said about the kind of gender roles here, because a lot of this book, as I was reading it, it felt really political and illuminating for me in this way for a specific subjectivity, and bucking these gender norms of like what is expected of a woman of a certain position and that Vidya inhabits from, as somebody who lives in Bombay at the time. And the autonomy that Vidya craves and exacts from her life, to me, is a very feminist take here. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about those decisions that you had to make as a writer to enliven, this kind of world, this kind of like heteropatriarchy to your readers.
Yeah, I was like, I was raised by somebody who identified herself. My mother identified herself as a feminist, and I was raised as a feminist. And so in some ways, I wanted to write a book that was a feminist book, but I didn't want it to feel, I wanted it to feel lived in, and that there's a lot of experiences. I think we have a certain notion of what feminism is, that in this culture that doesn't include a lot of, I don't know, like micro decisions that Vidya has to make, that she does housework sometimes, but also is dreaming in her head, things like there's a way where she's protecting her private life, that those might not necessarily be legible as political actions, but are to me like forms of resistance. And it felt important, like I would name this as a feminist book. I would even name Vidya as feminist, whether or not she might name herself that, because I think that there's a greater spectrum of feminism, of resistance, and of like troubling heteropatriarchy than we maybe are talking about right now. I think that I'm gonna do a spoiler. I think her marriage is a feminist act, because it's an act, even though it's a heterosexual marriage, it's an act where they're trying to disturb the power balance in between them, and that is the project. They're working really hard against a lot of societal pressures to create an egalitarian relationship within a really toxic framework, much like many people, much like many of us are doing in our particularly toxic framework here in America. So there was a lot of micro decisions that I wanted her to be making and thinking about that to me are feminist.
That makes it so real. Like you're absolutely right about those micro decisions and how those are like acts of resistance. Like, an act of resistance doesn't have to be this huge conflagration. It could be like, the decision that I'm going to, I don't know, dance in my mind. Right, like you're not going to touch this most interior part of me, and Vidya really maintains this integrity throughout the book. That is it's so wonderful to read, and to experience that Vidya going through this growth, and if you would call it growth, but character development perhaps. So
I would call it growth.
In about 2 minutes, we have to. In about 2 minutes, we're going to get to the questions that the audience has for you. But I have one more, quick question to that I'm dying to know. Is like, who are the writers that you love, and what influenced this book? What has moved you, and what shocks you back into your body?
I just love the way you phrase that. I guess that's what you get when you ask a poet to interview. You get very beautifully phrased questions. I some of the influences on this book are maybe a little surprising. I think actually the two greatest influences on this particular book, or at least my understanding, this book advances my personal philosophy on art making, which I did not develop on my own, but which is basically from Vivian Gornick's Fierce Attachments, and also sort of Philip Pullman's His Dark Materials trilogy. Weirdly enough, both of them talk about the act of consciousness and intention as being what defines art making. And that felt so vital and extremely exciting to me, and is something that is explored in this book. I also, I recently, in like the last couple of years, discovered a writer named Ambai, who's a writer. She writes in Tamil, and it's available in translation. And I was like, I felt it was a strange thing where when I was reading her, I felt like I obviously have been influenced by her, even though I've never read her. I don't understand how this happened, but I felt like I couldn't believe it when I was reading her work. It's so, there's some writers that I feel like they're calling me home, and I felt like she's calling me home. And another one of those writers, maybe very obviously, is Arundhati Roy, not just her fiction, but her nonfiction also. And I have to say, Rajiv, if you're asking for people who have shocked you into your body, I would ask you to please look in the mirror, because this book is very embodied. This is a book that really does shock you into your body, that all the experiences in this book that you write about are so deeply felt and experienced, vividly felt and experienced through the body. It's a very physically, like it's a very physical book in that way. And everybody should please also check this incredibly beautiful book out. And I would say it even if you are not currently interviewing me, because I really loved it.
Oh my God, you're so sweet. Thank you so much. Thank you actually for these I was jotting down the names, the fierce attachments. I'm so excited to dive in. And Ambai for sure. Like Ambai is where you get your epigraph for the book.
Yes. Yeah.
So that's fabulous. Thank you for your generous answers to these questions. We're going to move now into a question from the audience, from KChess, who asks, how did you approach writing about the 60s and 70s as a mythic setting that happens to be real? How much accountability did you feel for the details?
Oh, sorry. I started saying great question when you said the second. Can you say the second half of the question again?
How much accountability did you feel for the details?
Yeah. Okay, great. Yeah, great question. I felt a terrible, horrible sense of accountability, so much so that I was like paralyzed by, that was one of the reasons I think it took me so long in the beginning to start putting the story together, because I felt for at least a couple years like I was standing on the threshold asking to be let in and being like, do I have permission to go here? This is not my world. And I don't want to write something. I feel like maybe many writers of like whatever minority backgrounds feel this incredible weight of representation to do something accurately and respectfully, to represent their culture like accurately and respectfully. And this is even a little bit further outside my comfort zone because it's sort of my culture, but I didn't grow up in India. I grew up in America. So there were many times actually throughout this whole process where I was like, who asked you to write this, you idiot? Like, who gave you the most hard and terrifying assignment to you and is forcing you to write this? Like, why did you choose to do something so hard? But ultimately, I felt like, I don't know, I did feel like it was also it belonged to me. Like it belonged to me because it was like these stories had been told to me. It was where I came from, that my body feels a certain resonance when I'm at this place. And so I just stepped in and technically I did some research. Mostly I just talked to people who lived there and then, and mostly I talked to my mom. And it was great because you can't Google like, what kind of shoes did you wear to school? In like whatever in the 60s to elementary school or whatever, you have to ask your mom. And then but then you sort of get a particular memory and version of the city, which is what I was fine with that. I think you said very generously, Rajiv, that this book was a universe. And I think that Bombay then and now is a universe. There's so many, many, many worlds in this book and even more in real life. So choosing my path through it was going to be my own path. And I started to feel comforted by that it could be like, this doesn't have to be the Bombay in the 60s and 70s. This can be a Bombay in the 60s and 70s. So yeah, I would just rough it out and then feel like if anything was like way off course, I would have to completely rewrite it. But often I would just reach for a detail or put a placeholder in until I could really get true information. I wanted it to feel real, but I also didn't want to be so married to reality that I spent the whole time detailing apartment buildings or something. I wanted to paint enough trees in the background that you believed me, but without, necessarily painting each and every leaf.
Yeah. Wow. That's really, thank you so much for sharing about your process of this research. I mean, because this book is very deeply researched, whether it's Kathak, whether it's place and time, and that's also a thing about this like universe construction that you've done. We don't have any more questions from the audience, but I have, of course, more questions. If you don't mind, I'll ask you a question about like, you know, for my students that I'm going to direct to watching this again. What advice would you have for someone starting out wanting to write their first novel? What do you wish you would have known, or what is your best advice that you could give?
Well, I think that, you know, I didn't know how to write a novel until I wrote a novel. This is actually the second novel that I've written. And even though I had already written a novel, it was like a drawer novel that I just learned, I was like, how do you write a novel? You just keep writing pages and then eventually you like turn it into a story and it's a novel. And then, so despite having the experience of having written one novel, when I started to write this novel, I started over again from scratch. I had no idea how to write it. And I think that this might be the difference between story writing and novel writing is like, or maybe, well, story writing, you just, at some point you get like a muscle memory. You start to like have instincts for where the beats of a story will be or where the story is leading you or how to structure it. With the novel, it just feels like probably every time you try and write a novel, you have to reinvent the form of the novel, maybe even a little bit, in order to get across what you're trying to say. It's like each novel feels so different that we're like starting at square one every time. Who knows? Maybe not. I've only written 2 novels. What can I say? But I think that that's a beautiful place to be. I think that there's something so freeing about starting from the beginning, being a beginner, taking risks, like really, like I wrote a whole section of this book that was like, I went to a residency and I spent a whole month like writing my whole month I spent writing this whole long section. At the end of the section and the end of the residency, I was like, oh, I guess none of that happens. Good to know. Like I walked all the way down the path and I was like, nope, that is not part of the book at all. And, you know, just threw it out afterwards. So just being able to do that though, to be able to wander around and to make mistakes. And if it wasn't a mistake, I just knew that it wasn't in the novel anymore. But sometimes you have to go into a place where you understand where it's wrong to understand where you need to go next. I think that that's a really joyful and rich place to be. There's something about a novel also that I think it doesn't need to be perfect in a way that a story does. I think a story is always like a gymnast, like landing on her feet, you know, at the end. And that's like some of the pleasure of the story is just seeing that landing. And a novel can have that pleasure, but I actually think that the novels I love the most are not perfect. They have a kind of rawness, like a kind of energy that comes from the riskiness of it. And so if you wind up not writing a perfect novel, it's probably better for it. That's also a wonderful thing about the form.
Great. Wow, what incredible, marvelous advice to walk the path, even if you're going to throw the pages away. I'm going to carry that forever, Shruti. So much. Thank you for all of your generous answers to these questions. I mean, I'm so glad to be able to talk to you tonight.
Oh, same, Rajiv. It's lovely.
I want to thank you both again so much. Rajiv, I want to thank you for all of the generous questions, for your thought on this book. As Shruti said, this is what we get for asking a poet to join us in conversation. Just like I feel like we all sort of sat through a real craft masterclass. We could not recommend The Archer highly enough. Please do go get a copy of the book. Get Rajiv's book, get Shruti's other book from your local indie bookstore. I want to just very quickly close this out with a final couple of notes. Again, thank you to Shruti and Rajiv and all of our audience members for joining us online. I want to thank Annie and Shirley, our incredible ASL interpreters from Pro Bono ASL, for helping us make this event accessible. The event was recorded, as Rajiv mentioned, in sending this to his students. It will be on YouTube shortly, so you can revisit the conversation, send it to your students, colleagues, friends, family, anyone who you think could benefit from this conversation. And as I mentioned earlier, we just announced our fall event season. This event actually kicked everything off this September, which is so, so exciting. We hope we'll see you online for other events. And I'm actually going to turn the mic over to my colleague Vandana really quickly to tell you about another event that is coming up that will continue celebrating Shruti and this book.
Hey everyone, thank you so much, Shruti and Rajiv. That was an incredible conversation. I wanted to quickly share an upcoming event that you all may be interested in, featuring Shruti and the Leela Dance Collective, which is a Kathak dance performance company and teaching academy. So Leela Dance Collective brings together leading artists in the field to shape the future of Kathak dance and connect audiences to the richness of Indian classical art. So if reading about Kathak in The Archer got you interested in the dance and wanting to learn more, in October, AAWW will actually be collaborating with Leela to present a virtual beginners Kathak workshop. So along with that, we'll be doing a discussion with Shruti and Leela's founding artist and artistic director, Rachna Nivas. So definitely be on the lookout for more information about this event soon.
Thank you, Vandana. We are so excited to be partnering with Leela. And to end our night, we're actually going to put some slides back up on screen, play a little bit more music. And we hope everyone stays safe, takes good care, and we will see you online soon. And congratulations again, Shruti. We hope you have such a wonderful publication week, although I know a lot of it is going to be on Zoom. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you guys so much for having me. This was so wonderful.
Such a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.
Ginada,